Before I share HOA stories, here's how I learned to stand up to toxic people. Have you ever been so in love that it physically hurt? Not the good kind of hurt, the kind that leaves you questioning your worth, your sanity, your dreams. What happens when the person you love most becomes the person who destroys you? When your art becomes your enemy? When success feels like failure? Today, I'm telling you the true story of a writer who was trapped in a toxic relationship, rejected by publishers, and losing his mind. Until one day, on a lonely bus ride, he read a short story that changed everything. This isn't just about writing. This is about recognizing abuse, finding your voice, and discovering that sometimes the darkest stories hold the most light. If you've ever felt lost, if you've ever been in a relationship that was killing your soul, if you've ever wondered if your dreams are worth fighting for, this story will break your heart and put it back together. Get ready, because this journey goes deep. This is the story of a young writer I'll call David, and a love that was slowly killing him. Picture this: San Francisco, early 2000s. David was a struggling novelist pouring his heart into a book called Happy Baby, a dark, raw story about childhood trauma and how it shapes us. But every weekend, he'd make this impossible journey south of the city to see his girlfriend. No trains ran on weekends, so he'd catch buses that didn't stop at every station, often ending up at the wrong depot, waiting on those hard wooden benches for hours. But here's the thing that'll break your heart. David never knew if she'd let him sleep in the bed with her or if he'd end up on the floor. That's right. The woman he loved would literally decide, based on her mood, whether he deserved basic dignity. Sometimes she'd tell him to sleep on the floor, then call him to bed. Later, sometimes she wouldn't call at all. Can you imagine that psychological torture? Flying somewhere, spending money, exhausting yourself with travel, just to be treated like you're not even human. But David kept going back. Why? Because he thought this was what love looked like. See, David only saw her once a week because of the distance, and those visits would last 16 to 24 hours. But here's what's devastating. After every visit, he'd lie in bed the entire next day, barely able to move, constantly hungry, like he'd been beaten up or climbed a mountain. Those are his exact words. Love shouldn't leave you feeling like you survived a war zone. She hated his writing, this book he was pouring his soul into, this story about trauma and survival that was literally his life's work. She would read parts and tell him it was garbage. But then, and this is the cruel twist, she'd ask him to read more sections to her while she completely ignored him. Picture it. You're reading the most vulnerable parts of your soul to someone, and they're scrolling their phone, looking out the window, treating your dreams like background noise. David's editor was already pressuring him to make the book funnier, more commercial. If it had more light, there'd be a wider audience, they said. So he's getting destroyed at home by the woman he loves, pressured by his publisher to compromise his vision, and drowning in self-doubt about whether anyone would want to read such a dark story. But here's what's really heartbreaking. David was writing about a character named Theo, who was abused as a child by a guard in a detention center. This guard, Mr. Gracie, would hurt Theo but also protect him from other boys. So Theo grew up unable to distinguish between abuse and affection. He'd spent his whole life searching for Mr. Gracie's replacement, confusing pain with love. David didn't realize he was living his own story. His girlfriend's emotional abuse, her hot and cold treatment, her constant criticism. He thought this was passion. He thought this was what intense love looked like. The very trauma he was writing about, he was experiencing in real life. And the saddest part? David was so desperate for her approval that her rejection of his writing made him question everything. Should he make it funnier? Should he abandon the story that felt most true to him? Was his publisher right that nobody wanted to read about dark, difficult things? He loved her so much it made him physically ill sometimes. That's not poetry, that's a symptom. When love makes you sick, when it leaves you exhausted, when it makes you doubt your core identity and dreams, it's not love. It's addiction. It's trauma. It's abuse. But David didn't know that yet. He thought he was the problem. He thought he wasn't good enough, wasn't stable enough, wasn't worthy of sleeping in the same bed as the person he loved. Everything was about to change on one bus ride home. One story was about to save his life. Sometimes salvation comes in the most unexpected forms. For David, it came on a crowded bus, in the form of a 20-page short story that would shatter everything he thought he knew about life, love, and art. It was one of those exhausting trips back from his girlfriend's place. David was pressed against the bus window, feeling the bumps of the road through his forehead, emotionally drained as always. He was questioning everything, his relationship, his book, his future. Should he keep writing this dark, unmarketable novel? Should he stay with someone who made him feel worthless? Was he just fundamentally broken? That's when he opened a book of short stories and found I Want to Live by Tom Jones. On the surface, it seemed like the kind of story that shouldn't work. A woman finds out she has cancer and dies. It sounds almost cliché, right? Like it would be manipulative, too easy, too obvious. But something extraordinary happened as David read. Tom Jones had written with such perfect, devastating minimalism that every word felt like a punch to the chest. We meet Mrs. Wilson just as she's receiving her diagnosis, and we follow her through every small, terrible moment of dying. There's this scene that destroyed David. Mrs. Wilson is holding a carton of milk, starting to nod off from the medication, and she's fighting to stay awake because she knows the milk will spill. It's such a small thing, but it represents everything. The loss of control, the indignity, the desperate clinging to normal life, even as it slips away. And then comes the line that broke David completely. Forget the Schopenhauer. What a lot of crap that was. She did not want to cross over. She wanted to live. She wanted to live. David started crying right there on the bus, surrounded by strangers. He was trying to hide it, pressing his face to the window, but the tears wouldn't stop. Why was this hitting him so hard? Why did this fictional woman's death feel so real, so immediate? And then it clicked. His mother, David's mother, had died of multiple sclerosis when he was young. 5 years of watching her waste away on the couch, unable to even make it to the bathroom. But he'd been just 8 years old when it started. Too young, too selfish, too overwhelmed to really understand what she was going through. For the first time, through Mrs. Wilson's experience, David could feel what his mother had felt. The fear, the frustration, the desperate desire to live even as your body betrays you. He was finally grieving his mother properly, finally understanding the magnitude of what she'd endured. But the story did something else. It showed him what real art could do. Tom Jones wasn't trying to entertain anyone. He wasn't worried about being too depressing or unmarketable. He was excavating truth from the darkest corners of human experience and presenting it with such clarity and compassion that it became beautiful. David read the story again immediately. Then again. Each time he cried harder, but it was a different kind of crying now. It was recognition. It was relief. It was the feeling of being truly seen and understood. Other passengers on the bus were looking at him strangely, but David didn't care anymore. Something fundamental was shifting inside him. He realized that happiness, at least in fiction, was bullshit. Not that people shouldn't be happy in real life, but that art's job wasn't to make people feel good. Art's job was to tell the truth, even when that truth was uncomfortable, even when it made people cry on buses. He thought about his novel, Happy Baby, about Theo's confusion between abuse and affection. He thought about his editor's notes to make it funnier, more accessible, and he thought about his girlfriend's constant dismissal of his work. Suddenly, all of it seemed so clear. The most important thing fiction could do was illuminate truths that couldn't be discovered any other way. Mrs. Wilson's story had taught him more about death, love, and the preciousness of life than years of philosophy or therapy. As the bus pulled into 8th and Mission Street, David knew his life was about to change forever. Have you ever had a moment where suddenly, brutally, everything makes sense? Where all the puzzle pieces of your life click into place so fast it takes your breath away? That's what happened to David as he walked those dark San Francisco streets toward his tiny studio apartment. The story was still burning in his mind. Mrs. Wilson's desperate cry, "I want to live!" kept echoing as he climbed the stairs to his cramped space on Mission Street. And then, alone in his room, surrounded by pages of his manuscript, David finally broke down completely. But this wasn't just about the story anymore. This wasn't just about his mother's death or even his toxic relationship. This was about everything. About the lies we tell ourselves, about the ways we accept less than we deserve, about how trauma shapes us in ways we don't even recognize. David suddenly understood why he kept going back to that girlfriend who treated him like garbage, why he slept on floors and begged for scraps of affection, why he thought love was supposed to hurt, supposed to be a battle you never quite win. His character Theo had learned to associate abuse with affection because that's all he knew. The guard who molested him also protected him, creating this twisted psychological pattern where pain and love became inseparable. David realized with devastating clarity that he was living the same pattern. His mother's illness had created its own form of trauma. Watching someone you love suffer helplessly, feeling responsible but powerless, it had taught him that love comes with pain, that caring for someone means accepting your own suffering as normal. So when his girlfriend criticized his writing, ignored him, made him sleep on the floor, he didn't see abuse. He saw intensity. He saw passion. He saw love that was real because it hurt. But I Want to Live had shown him what real love looked like. The way Tom Jones wrote about Mrs. Wilson with such tenderness, such respect for her dignity even in death. The way her son-in-law, initially portrayed as worthless, becomes unexpectedly heroic when given the chance to care for her. Real love doesn't diminish people. It doesn't make them smaller. It honors them, even in their darkest moments. David sat at his desk and looked at his manuscript with new eyes. His editor wanted him to make it funnier, more accessible. His girlfriend called it depressing garbage, but Tom Jones had just proven that the darkest stories could be the most profound, the most necessary. He made a decision that would change his career forever. He cut every adjective that wasn't essential. He removed all the explanatory backstory. He stopped trying to make Theo's story palatable or comfortable. He wasn't going to explain away the darkness or apologize for the difficult truths he was exploring. Instead, he was going to trust his readers to handle the truth. He was going to write about how childhood trauma creates these impossible patterns, where we seek out what hurts us because it feels familiar. He was going to explore, through fiction, the terrible ways we confuse abuse with love. And more than that, he was going to stop accepting abuse in his own life. David realized he'd been so focused on making everyone else happy, his editor, his publisher, his girlfriend, that he'd lost sight of why he became a writer in the first place. To tell the truth, to excavate something real from the darkness, to help people understand parts of human experience that otherwise remain hidden. I Want to Live had been selected for Best American Short Stories. It was going to be in the Best American Short Stories of the Century. Critics called it a masterpiece, not despite its sadness, but because of its unflinching honesty about the human condition. That night, David knew he would never write anything as good as Tom Jones's story, but that didn't mean he shouldn't strive toward that same virtue, that commitment to truth over comfort. depth over accessibility, art over entertainment. He looked at his phone, thought about calling his girlfriend, thought about the cycle they were trapped in. But for the first time in months, he didn't call. For the first time, he chose himself, chose his art, chose truth over the familiar pain of toxic love. The hardest part was just beginning. Breaking cycles is never clean. It's not like the movies where you have one realization and suddenly everything changes. Real transformation is messy, painful, full of backslides and false starts. David was about to learn this the hard way. Even after that life-changing moment with the Tom Jones story, even after his profound realizations about love and art and truth, David stayed with his girlfriend for almost another year, a whole year. Let that sink in for a moment. He knew the relationship was toxic. He understood the patterns. He'd committed to changing his life, and yet he kept going back to that same destructive cycle every weekend. Why? Because understanding something intellectually and being able to change it emotionally are two completely different things. David and his girlfriend, their connection ran on pure, destructive passion. They both knew it was unsustainable. They both knew it was unhealthy. But passion, especially when it's mixed with trauma, creates an addiction that's incredibly hard to break. Think about it. She was everything he thought he wanted. Intense, unpredictable, artistic, passionate. She made him feel alive even when she was destroying him. The highs were so high that they made the lows seem worth it. Classic trauma bonding. During that year, David finished Happy Baby. He implemented everything he'd learned from reading I Want to Live. Every funny joke got cut. Every easy explanation disappeared. Every moment that prioritized reader comfort over reader truth was eliminated. He was writing the most honest, brutal, necessary book of his life, and his girlfriend hated it even more than before. "This is so dark," she'd say. "It's depressing. Who's going to want to read this?" She couldn't understand why he'd made it harder, more challenging, less commercial. In her mind, he was sabotaging his own success. But something had fundamentally shifted in David. For the first time in his life, he didn't care if she approved of his work. The story needed to be told the way it needed to be told. His job as a writer wasn't to make people comfortable, it was to make them feel something true. He started sharing the Tom Jones story with other writers, other friends. Some loved it. Many thought it was too sad. People don't like being confronted with mortality, with pain, with the uncomfortable realities of being human. But David had learned that the most important art isn't supposed to be easy to digest. Throughout this year, David was living this strange double life. In his writing, he was becoming more honest, more authentic, more committed to truth than ever before. But in his relationship, he was still trapped in the same destructive patterns, still sleeping on floors, still accepting emotional abuse as normal. The cognitive dissonance was exhausting. He was writing about a character who couldn't distinguish between abuse and affection, while literally living in a relationship where he couldn't make that same distinction. The irony was almost too much to bear. But slowly, painfully, things began to shift. Each time she criticized his work, it stung a little less. Each time she made him sleep on the floor, he felt a little more disgusted with himself for accepting it. Each time she ignored him while he read his writing aloud, he questioned a little more why he was with someone who showed such contempt for the thing he cared about most. The relationship was becoming unsustainable, and they both knew it. You can only run on passion for so long before reality sets in. You can only ignore fundamental incompatibilities for so long before they destroy everything. And then, in a twist that feels almost too perfect for fiction, she left him. She decided to pursue someone more stable, someone who wouldn't challenge her, wouldn't ask for real intimacy, wouldn't demand that she grow or change or confront difficult truths. David was heartbroken, but he was also relieved. The decision had been made for him. The cycle was finally broken, not by his strength, but by her choice to find someone who would enable her patterns instead of challenging them. A month before they broke up, Happy Baby was published. And in the ultimate irony, once the relationship pressure was gone, once she didn't have to engage with it as his girlfriend, she decided she actually liked the book after all. Here's what David learned, and what I hope will change your life the way it changed his. Sometimes the most important thing that happens to you is also the most painful. Sometimes the story that saves your life is the one that makes you cry the hardest. I Want to Live taught David something that goes far beyond writing, far beyond toxic relationships, far beyond his personal struggles. It taught him that truth, real, unflinching, uncomfortable truth, is the most powerful force in the world. Think about Mrs. Wilson's story. There's no happy ending, there's no miracle cure, no last-minute rescue, no inspirational speech about beating cancer. There's just a woman facing death with all the fear and dignity and desperate love of life that any of us would have. And somehow, that brutal honesty becomes beautiful. It becomes sacred. David realized that he'd spent years trying to make his art more palatable, more commercially viable, more acceptable to people who were fundamentally uncomfortable with difficult truths. But the greatest art throughout history, from Greek tragedies to Shakespeare to modern masterpieces like Tom Jones's work, has never been about making people comfortable. It's been about making people more human. His novel, Happy Baby, went on to receive critical acclaim, not despite its darkness, but because of its unflinching examination of how childhood trauma shapes adult relationships. Readers wrote to David saying the book helped them recognize their own patterns, understand their own relationships, seek therapy, leave abusive situations. One reader wrote, "I finally understood why I kept dating men who treated me badly. Your book saved my life." Another said, "I've been in therapy for years and never understood my behavior patterns until I read your story." This is what real art does. It doesn't just entertain, it illuminates. It helps people understand parts of themselves they couldn't access any other way. It creates empathy, connection, recognition, healing. But the most profound lesson David learned wasn't about writing, it was about living. He learned that we teach people how to treat us by what we accept. He learned that love isn't supposed to hurt, that passion isn't supposed to be destructive, that real intimacy requires safety and respect, not just intensity. He learned that the same patterns that destroy us personally often show up in our professional lives, our friendships, our relationship with ourselves. The way his girlfriend dismissed his work mirrored the way he'd learned to dismiss his own needs, his own worth, his own truth. Most importantly, he learned that healing isn't linear. Even after his breakthrough moment on the bus, even after understanding intellectually what was wrong, it took him another year to actually change his life. And that's okay, that's human. Real change takes time, especially when you're unraveling patterns that go back to childhood. David eventually found healthy love, relationships built on mutual respect, support, encouragement. He learned what it felt like to be with someone who celebrated his work instead of diminishing it, who wanted to build him up instead of tear him down. But he never forgot that toxic relationship because it taught him something invaluable about the human condition. It showed him how easily we can mistake intensity for intimacy, chaos for passion, familiar pain for love. Years later, when David encounters that Tom Jones story again, he still cries. Not just because it's beautiful, not just because it reminds him of his mother, but because it represents a turning point in his life when he chose truth over comfort, authenticity over acceptance, art over commercial success. Here's what I want you to take from David's story. Your pain has purpose if you let it. Your struggles can become art, wisdom, connection with others who are fighting similar battles. The things that nearly destroy you can become the things that save not just you, but other people too. Don't make your art smaller to make other people more comfortable. Don't make your life smaller to make other people feel better about themselves. The world needs your truth, your story, your authentic voice, even if, especially if, it makes people uncomfortable. And if you're in a relationship that leaves you feeling exhausted, questioning your worth, sleeping on floors, literal or metaphorical, remember David's story. Remember that love shouldn't diminish you. It should expand you. Sometimes the saddest stories hold the most hope. Sometimes breaking completely open is the only way to heal. This taught me how to deal with difficult neighbors and HOA Karens. If this story touched your heart, hit that subscribe button and tell me in the comments, what's one truth you've been afraid to face in your own life? Your story matters too, and I'll see you in the next video where we dive deep into more life-changing moments. Until then, keep choosing truth over comfort.